Thank you so much, Sasha, for flying over from San Francisco and being here today with us. So for this session, we'll talk about three main topics, okay? The first one is transition, the second is resilience, and the third is disruption. So Sasha, as we saw, right, you started your career in sports in the Olympic stage, one that requires first precision, second discipline, and of course, long-term focus. Every 4 years we have an Olympics. So what was the moment that you decided to make this move from sports to finance? And the second point is, what led you to Morgan Stanley, right? And why specifically disruptive change?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to get to speak to you all today and share a little bit about my story. I spent the first part of my life and my first career as an Olympic athlete. I competed in 2 Olympic Games. And around the time that I was 25, there were other interests, other things that I wanted to pursue, primarily in education, and to really experience the world outside of the lens of an elite athlete. And that led me to New York City, attending Columbia University, where I received a wonderful liberal arts education and was in the heart of kind of the financial world in New York. And I had an opportunity to spend time with hedge funds like Millennium and Fortress, and also to really navigate the different parts of Morgan Stanley, especially within investment management. And I was very fortunate to connect with the team at Counterpoint Global because of their unique way of thinking about investment opportunities, the culture, which you can really see in the reading networks, the personality tests, the way that they think about how disruption can take place, and really the importance of that, because most of the returns are coming from a small handful of companies, and these are usually companies that are riding the next wave of a new business model or new way of consumers interacting in the marketplace. And so this role was really exciting, and I loved the culture and philosophy of the team, and that's what led me specifically to Morgan Stanley's Counterpoint Global.
Very, very exciting. And I think one last point on your career, right? I think you lived the American dream, a word that here we hear a lot, right? Both as a professional sportswoman and also now in a leading investment team in the Wall Street. So what do you think is it about the US that make this big transition possible? And the second point is, what for you is the American dream today?
I think culturally, America was really, it's built as, it's like the dreams of immigrants, people coming without social constraints or hierarchies with a dream and a vision to do something new, to create a better life. And it's all about possibility and opportunity. And I think that really seeps into the ideas of the American dream. And certainly as a young kid, my ideas about what I thought I could do. And to me, the American dream is really defined by what can you do with your talent and with your hard work, and how far can that take you? And there should be no other ceiling besides, those two things. And that led me to a tremendous career in sports. And then I think something that the world is facing more and more frequently these days, and athletes always face, is the prospect of reinvention. You've had one identity, one way of doing things through these formative years of your life, your childhood, your teenage years, your early 20s, and then the natural arc of an athlete, you kind of start to reach kind of a decline in your abilities, which is much different than retiring from a career in finance, maybe in your 60s. So there's this kind of forced mechanism that you need to reinvent and do something else. And luckily, America has an incredible system and network of universities that enable someone with the drive and the skill set to build a new set of skills and then go on to do something else. And then remind me the second part of your question.
So the second point is, what is the American dream for you today?
Today, I think, the American dream continues to be to see how far my talents and my hard work can take me. And I think we're living in a time of, great globalization, great interconnection, 24/7 news sources, and it's gotten more complicated, but I think there's still something very beautiful about that original ethos around which the American dream was created. And I come from a family of immigrants that my mom came to this country when she was 16 and started over and built a new life for herself. And I think that type of spirit of adventure and willingness to start over in a place that's unfamiliar feeds into kind of the hard work and the drive that's part of the American dream.
Very exciting. So if we can now have slides, we'll have just a few just to help us contextualize this conversation. So for those that are not familiar, Sasha is part of Counterpoint Global, right? They are one of the key investment teams within Morgan Stanley Investment Management. They're responsible for managing $23 billion of assets, as I mentioned before. And they have invested through these 30 years, more than 30 years, right, in early stages in companies that today we know very well, right, and are very recognized by everyone as a great investment to do. But they did it before, right? They did it in early stages. And part of this opportunity and the part of them finding these companies is through what Sasha does, right? That is research about disruptive change. So Sasha, please describe to us what is really disruptive change about, right? And I think the second point is, what kind of questions do you make to the companies, like when you are looking to technologies, to really see if there is a disruption in there or not really?
So disruptive change research is a really...
And sorry to interrupt. If we can please have the slides on the TV, that will help the conversation. Thank you. Thank you so much. Please, Sasha.
So disruptive change research, I think now is something we hear a lot. It's become a little bit of a buzzword, but it's something that Counterpoint Global began doing over 20 years ago. And this type of research has led to really seminal projects that have informed really important investments that have created a tremendous outperformance. And so it's something that we focus on and enables us to see new trends quite early. And so really the focus is to investigate big ideas, emerging themes, and this is where we think there will be a great deal of value creation and destruction in the next 5 to 10 years. And so if we can understand the dynamics of what is happening, then we can begin to identify potential winners in this space, and not only understand the total addressable market maybe today, but how consumers or businesses might fundamentally shift how they operate and create markets that are, infinitely bigger than what we see today. And then this is not a research effort that's disconnected from our portfolio and from our investors, but there is kind of like a day-to-day and week-to-week conversation about themes that matter. And so we may find ideas from a leading science publication or a venture podcast, or potentially from an investor who's just listened in on an earnings call and hears a new technology or theme that seems to be increasingly important and something we should understand. And a good example of this was in 2016 or 2017, when 2 of our top 10 companies, Amazon and Netflix, both had businesses that were very dependent on algorithms, whether that was for search or generating kind of predictive content about what the customer would like to watch. And so we knew at that time that machine learning and AI would be very important for these companies, for our holdings, and probably more broadly and for other companies as well. And that led my colleague, Stan Delaney, to already begin his work on machine learning and AI back in 2017. So these are kind of just examples of how tightly integrated this is into building a portfolio, not only what we want to own, but just as much sectors we want to avoid that may have more risk of being disrupted.
Super. So now I think taking a look and trying to better understand and have some examples around your investments in the past, right? And just for everybody's reference, this team started investing in Amazon in 2004. And if we do recall, Amazon specifically was down over 90%, 90, after the dot-com bubble, right? And it took them over a decade to recover. And another nice example to share with you today is Facebook, now Meta, that the team invested pre-IPO. So Sasha, what enables you and the team to find these opportunities so early? And the second point is, how do you build conviction to these companies when others might not see it as an opportunity yet?
So in terms of spotting companies earlier, there are a number of different lenses or frameworks that we use to think about a company or a technology. And kind of the first big one is, does this technology solve a real problem for a real person? After that, we think about, is it a lot better or is it a lot cheaper? And we really feel like these are things that need to be met to have a meaningful product with customer adoption. And this framework was kind of one of the reasons we were not excited about the metaverse, because we didn't think it really solved a real world problem for most real people. It was kind of an interesting fringe use case, but not the type of company or prospect that we got really excited about. And going back to the work that led to our conviction in Meta, or Facebook at the time, which was, I'll say, I was done before I joined the team, but those type of case studies were reasons that I really was excited to join Counterpoint Global. But my colleague Stan Delaney did an early project on digital advertising, I think in 2002, 2003, and saw that at that time, only 3% of digital advertising dollars were going online. The rest was traditional media like TV, radio, newspapers, and consumers were already spending 20% of their time online. So there was already this mismatch and there's this disconnect, and that led us to believe we should try to find leaders in online spaces that could generate revenue from online advertising. And this led us to both Google, which captured the search, as well as Facebook, which captured a lot, I think about 20% of all digital advertising spend at its peak. And Facebook also benefited from the power of social networks, which is something we observed early with MySpace. And MySpace didn't quite execute successfully, but that already showed us how powerful social networks could be, and just kind of added on another layer of uniqueness and a moat that Facebook had.
And adding on these two paths of disruptive change, could you please give us some examples and try to explain this framework that I think is very keen for the team?
Absolutely. So we think of disruptive change really happening in two main ways. And the first is top-down disruption, where you have high-end users that are early adopters, and then the mass market would adopt later. And a great example of this is Tesla. They started with a much more expensive premium product, and with scale, the cost came down meaningfully, which ultimately grew total market adoption. The other example is a bottom-up disruption, where low-end users are the early adopters. And this is done with companies that are offering kind of a cheaper product. And Cloudflare is a great example of this, where they came in and they had free or very low-cost services for developers or websites that traditional enterprise had left out. Over time, Cloudflare improved their offering and began to compete and take share and moved up market and took share from these traditional enterprise providers. So these are kind of two main ways that we see disruption carried out on a big scale.
Super. And how do you build convictions in these opportunities?
That's a great question. Conviction is something that I like to say. You can borrow someone's investment ideas, but you can't borrow their conviction. And conviction comes from the work that we do, and conviction is built over time. So with many of these new technologies or big themes, we spend a lot of time understanding the technology and its potential total addressable market, but then we come up with milestones that look like success. If this technology hits these milestones in this time frame, we would want to increase our position, or this is something that de-risks the technology for us. And so that's something that we've historically done with new technologies, is start with a very small position, and as milestones are hit, add to that position over time.
Great. I think now getting into some of the great work you've been doing, right? And the first one is energy, something that we know you are working extensively for quite a while now. It's a very urgent and I think also fascinating, disruptive topic these days. So based on your research, how are the energy systems around the world evolving to basically meet the growing demand of AI and other technologies?
Energy is very interesting, and I think has been overlooked until I think the last year or two. And really that's because for 20 years we had flat electricity usage. And in the last 2 years, we're seeing this hockey stick up and to the right in terms of demand. And that's caused this massive scramble among hyperscalers to secure power and figuring out where they're going to get it from, and they're assembling all different power sources and how can they get it quickly, because winning the AI race is dependent upon power. 5 years ago, I think there was a lot more cost sensitivity around power, but now compared to the prize of winning AI and the cost of GPUs, the cost of electricity is really not so meaningful in that overall equation. And I've spent time looking at a number of verticals within energy: nuclear fusion, small modular reactors within nuclear fission, long duration energy storage, even next generation battery chemistries and synthetic fuels. Because we can electrify many things, but we cannot electrify long haul aviation anytime in the near future. The batteries would just be too heavy. And so to decarbonize, you would have to kind of create a green fuel, a green aviation fuel, or e-diesel for trucking. So I think the energy piece is going to be multifaceted, and renewables will play a role as well. But I think something that's very important to point out with renewables that ties in with long duration energy storage is that our grids can only handle a certain percentage of intermittent power. So power that comes on and off. Above a certain percentage, it destabilizes the grid, and that needs to be curtailed. So you just shut off any excess solar or wind that's being created to not destabilize the grid and cause a blackout. And we think, for instance, storage, long duration energy storage, can be very disruptive when it shifts from a 4-hour time frame to allowing for baseload energy, which is a 24/7 power source. So if we could see 12 hours, 24 hours plus, becomes very interesting for allowing the renewable penetration to go much, much higher, and now finally shutting off the coal and gas that you still need now, no matter how much renewable power you create, because you can't store it efficiently and effectively. And then I think I'll kind of finally touch on fusion and small modular reactors. 5 years ago, no one wanted to touch nuclear fission in the US. Reactors were being decommissioned, and the cost of nuclear was considered too high. We stopped building nuclear fission because it was too expensive, projects ran over time, and renewables were kind of all the rage. But now with AI, we need firm power, we need huge amounts of firm power, and we've seen hyperscalers sign contracts for all the existing nuclear capacity in the US, as well as decommissioned plants set to be brought back online and selling their power to various hyperscalers. And this is the time to power theme, meaning how fast can we get power, what's available, because to build a new nuclear plant would take 5+ years. That's very exciting, but nuclear fission is still regulated by the NRC. It's very, very difficult and very onerous. So this is one reason why we really are excited about nuclear fusion. It has a different regulatory regime, much easier to build and permit. It's much safer. It doesn't have proliferation costs or issues. The fuel costs are low, and it's the most dense form of energy. It's 4,000 times more energy dense than nuclear fission, 4 million times more dense than coal or gas. And we've hit 2 huge milestones lately that make nuclear fusion less of a science project and more of a possibility to commercialize as a power plant. And those are achieving net energy gain for the first time, which is more energy out than needed to create the fusion reaction. And then finally, we've seen real advances in material science, where we can create magnetic fields twice as strong as previously possible with new magnet technology. And this means you can build a reactor much, much smaller, so it's now economically viable. So those are just a few of the things within energy. There's a lot there, and it's very nuanced. And I guess the last piece I'll add is the increasing importance around the world and with this U.S. administration for reasons of energy independence and national security. And so we're seeing funding and prioritization like we haven't seen before.
But regarding nuclear fusion specifically, are there like large companies working on this, or these projects are being developed by smaller companies in the market? Do you, Counterpoint Global, already see opportunities? Are you investing into this type of companies or not yet?
We think fusion is very promising, and we started to follow it closely right around the time net gain was achieved for the first time. I started to attend fusion conferences, and met with various scientists and founders, and I've really seen the fusion ecosystem expand in size and seen major catalysts like contracts with hyperscalers and contracts with utilities that are making fusion kind of more prime and ready for investment. Right now, all the nuclear fusion companies are private. They're not yet public. But again, we like to get to know companies, understand the various technologies and the business models they would use, so that as the technology matures and more milestones are hit, that we would be kind of ready to jump in and invest because we have enough conviction and have done the work.
Great, great. Another point we can see here on screen is longevity, right? So aging affects everyone, and of course, everyone here is trying to also slow it down. So from your research, how longevity tech could help us have a more healthy life and, of course, extend our life, right?
So longevity is one of those fields that everyone is interested in, I think, especially once you get to be over a certain age, it becomes of increasing importance. And a good friend of mine said that the good news is he thinks we've reached escape velocity, meaning that the science is advancing at such a pace that as long as we don't do anything stupid like ski off of a cliff, that the science will kind of catch up and help us to rejuvenate ourselves and turn back the clock. And there are many nuances to thinking about longevity as a business, and the research that is mainly being done now in various academic institutions or national labs. But the first problem with longevity as a business model is that the FDA doesn't recognize aging as a disease, which means that you can't run an FDA trial for aging or to cure aging. But what you can do is you can bucket longevity into 4 major pillars. The first of which is prevention, which we mainly see supplement companies that are an out-of-pocket cost and different formulations that promise to prevent cellular damage, et cetera. Another space is the diagnostic space, which would be something like a full-body MRI to check for tumors, to identify cancer that you would not be symptomatic till stage 3 or 4, but you can see it visually at stage 1. The other area would be age-related drug-specific targets. So types of diseases that we might have that are related to aging. And this you can take through an FDA process and then try to apply those successes more broadly to aging as the field matures. And then finally is rejuvenation, which is, I think, the most early stage and speculative at this point, but really focusing on how do we turn back the clock and take our cells back to an earlier state of age, 10 years younger, et cetera. And this is done by changing the cells kind of back to this pluripotent stem cell where you erase the identity as a liver cell or a skin cell or a brain cell back to the very early identity it had in embryo, where it didn't have an identity yet, and those were yet to be created. And so this is kind of a way of turning back the clock on time, and it's still very much in a scientific research phase. So we think this is really interesting and eventually could be a very big market, because the U.S. spends an inordinate amount of money on healthcare costs. The average American spends the last 16 years of their life in very poor health with multiple chronic diseases. And something that's very interesting, which is why we think longevity is a field we want to follow, is that as we age, chronologically and biologically, the different organs in our body age at various rates in different people. But what happens is general metabolic dysfunction, and that is very highly correlated with increased age. And so these diseases, these chronic diseases like diabetes and cancer, are related to aging. And right now we're very focused on solving them one at a time. Research for cancer, research for diabetes, like separate cures. But I think leading scholars in the longevity field think that it's all related. If you solve cancer for somebody, there's going to be a different age-related disease that affects them and ultimately kills them. So understanding longevity and how that causes chronic disease is something we're on the cusp of. And I think you can kind of tie it back into where we were 100, 120 years ago when infectious disease was the primary killer. But then we began to understand that, understand how to address and prevent malaria, other infectious diseases. So now infectious disease kills very few people in the developed world. So again, very interesting space, but we're waiting for additional inflection points before we think longevity is an investable space.
But a similar point as we did for energy, do you see also large companies, for example, in the beauty space, researching this, taking interesting in, and maybe even developing something? Or it's really on the startup side that we see more opportunities these days, and of course, still very early stages?
In terms of the beauty side or skin, I think there is maybe the tendency to apply characteristics like grape skins will rejuvenate your skin, but they're based on a different type of claim and maybe focus specifically on the skin or beauty. I think the more serious work in the longevity field is mainly coming out of academic labs and think tanks like the Buck Institute. And then there are a few early stage biotech companies that are trying to raise money have a milestone that's reachable and near term, and so they're choosing an age-related target to go after, so that eventually they can have insurance companies reimburse, and the Wall Street, the medical model, understands the process.
Great. A question a little bit out of the box here and out of script. So you live in San Francisco, right? Of course, you travel a lot. You're here in Europe a few weeks ago. Is going back in a couple. So being in San Francisco, do you think is a great place to be in California, where all this technology is being developed with these companies, and of course your work, you think it supports you and the team?
I moved to San Francisco about 2 years ago, and I think it's tremendous in terms of opportunity and what I'm exposed to, just because of the way that people think. All the AI companies and robotics companies that I visit and what they're doing, and that's just kind of the living, breathing ethos in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. There's an incredible venture capital network, and it also, I think, ties into what makes disruptive change unique, and part of that is how we source information. And we're generally sourcing our information from unique sources, not the sell side, because we're typically doing these projects before these trends are officially covered. One of my favorite ways to source ideas is the TED conference. So if you've ever watched a TED Talk, you'll know what I'm talking about. But I've found many new technologies that are spun out of a Stanford lab that I'm hearing about before there's even a website. 3 years before you're hearing about it in New York, or there's a Wall Street Journal article, and that's just been incredible for idea generation. And then when I went to TED for the first time, I realized most of the people that attended were from the Bay Area, and they really valued this way of thinking, and that makes sense because it ties into the venture ecosystem. And then again, one other thing that's beneficial for Counterpoint Global is that we also have a late stage ventures fund, and so that gives us the time and opportunity to straddle the public and private markets. And the more time you spend in late stage private markets, you start to understand what's happening in earlier stage and seed. And this is kind of like the beginning of where ideas are generating before they snowball and get bigger and bigger, and then all of a sudden they're huge, and you know, every mutual fund is piling in New York and around the world. So I think moving from New York to San Francisco has been very advantageous for my work and what I'm exposed to.
Really great. So now we are coming to the end. I just want to make one last personal question, and of course afterwards we'll have a bit of a reflection, but what are you reading these days? What do you listen to? What would you recommend us to really get new ideas and hear more about disruptive change research?
It depends on my project, and I think this is one of the things that ties back to being a solo athlete versus a team athlete, is that I had to create my schedule, find the best coach, the best choreographer, the right trainer at the time for the skills I was trying to develop. And with disruptive change, it's thematic. And sometimes I'm in the healthcare space. Sometimes I'm in education, energy. And so I need to constantly find a new network that I cultivate. And I oftentimes leverage the folks that I know in the venture capital community. But I think some podcasts that have been very helpful to me are A16Z, which is the Andreessen Horowitz podcast. I've also really enjoyed Invest Like the Best, very thoughtful, detailed episodes on founders or specific technologies. And then I find myself doing a lot of specific reading books. For instance, right now I'm looking at the defense industry and disruption that's happening there. And so I'm reading very industry-specific books of people that have worked in disruptive verticals of the defense industry, either with the DoD or on the private side. And so each project is a new place to start. But I guess the last general aggregator that I really like is 13D, What I Learned This Week. And it brings together maybe 10 really interesting themes across commodities, politics, new technologies, education, and really kind of what's pertinent at the time with a very thoughtful, deep analysis.
Great, great. So now cutting to the chase, I think just a reflection. So what was one mindset or habit that helped you succeed both in finance and in sports and keeps moving you forward?
I will have to choose three. Three different values. And I think the first, of course, is persistence. As an athlete, 9 out of 10 days, you're not feeling great. You're injured, you're sore, it's a struggle. You're not making the improvements that you would like to, and you're anxious and stressed because the competition is a few months away. And so you have to have the ability to persist and show up even when it's hard. And I think that's very important in sports and also very important in investing when market sentiment can shift. Even though your belief in a technology or an investment hasn't. And so you have to kind of double down on the work and continue to persist through that if it's something you believe in. The second is adaptability. I competed through several changes in the judging system. And so you have to constantly be willing to go back to the drawing board. How can I improve my technique? What is now valued and rewarded under this new system that wasn't last year? And so there's a constant iteration and reinvention cycle that was necessary in my career in sports to continue to improve and to make sure that I was competitive. In the world of investing, I think adaptability has never been more important. The rate at which we're seeing technological change has, I think, never been faster, and it's a convergence of many technologies, including AI, robotics, synthetic biology, machine learning. There are just a number of things that even on their own, autonomous vehicles that are incredibly transformative, but combined, I think will create orders of magnitude of, a scale of change we haven't ever seen, and that will happen in the next decade or so. I think it's very important as an investor and an analyst to be adaptable. And I think this is what gives a generalist this unique advantage over a sector specialist who has spent their whole life looking at beverage or tobacco or hardware, is that we can come in without preconceived notions and ask questions that a specialist wouldn't ask. And we can tie together disruptive models that we've seen from other industries and how it might happen in this specific industry. So that we found to be quite helpful in helping us to be adaptable and navigate these shifts in markets and technology. And then finally is a sense of humility. In sports, I like to say that you're only as good as your last performance, and you can't take anything for granted. You have to go home and train and be just as good as you were in order to win a medal again. You can't rest on your laurels. Within the investment world, that is similar when you have identified a winning company, but will it continue to win? Have conditions changed? So we're constantly reassessing what we own, how things are changing, and where there's the most opportunity for upside. And also at the same time, reassess when you may be wrong. 2 years into conviction around a new idea, is it working out as planned? Are milestones being hit? Do you have the cognitive flexibility to reassess and maybe examine your thesis if it hasn't worked out as you anticipated?
Thank you so much for your insights. Such an inspiring conversation. So it's been a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you, Avenue, for the opportunities on this second Avenue Connections. We're looking forward to seeing you throughout the day. And all the best. Muito obrigado. Um abraço.
Thank you.